Okay, we've covered cancer, the creation of cancer, and today we're going to talk about epidemiology, which is a big deal. Who's likely to get it? Who's not likely to get it? What things might make you more likely to get it? And we'll touch briefly on cancer in children. When we get to the individual body systems, we'll talk about specific childhood diseases, childhood cancers. But here are just a couple of things that make childhood cancer slightly different than adult cancer. My clicker's not going to work today, so I'll be going over to the computer now and then to change slides. Okay, so cancer risk is very multifactorial. Some things are genetically determined, some are somewhat genetically determined. You know, if both of your parents had cancer early, you're more likely to have cancer. But there are a lot of things that you do during your life as well that make you more or less likely to get cancer yourself. Cancers basically are genetic. We talked about that. Either it's a faulty gene that you're born with, or one that becomes faulty during your life because of multiple mutations over time, or because you've been exposed to carcinogens. So lifestyle, environmental factors. And remember this epigenetics thing, because some cancers will occur right in your DNA. You'll have a mutated DNA particle that due to a carcinogen, due to something you were born with, or due to a virus or something that might change the DNA for you. But a lot of cancers are caused by changes in the epigenetics. These small substances, the microRNAs and the like, that are around the DNA and help decide which genes are turned on or turned off, which ones are expressed and which ones are not. If you screw those up and you turn on the wrong genes, then you've messed up that cell and you can cause it to morph into a cancer cell. Most carcinogens don't directly change the DNA. They change your epigenetics in some way that then causes your DNA to be improperly stimulated. So, your genetic predisposition, epigenetics that might be altered, environmental factors will all play a role in this. It's, again, one reason why it's so hard to really figure out who's going to get the cancer. The genetic and epigenetic processes can start while you're still a fetus because so many fetal cells are like stem cells to begin with. You don't start out with every kind of cell you're going to wind up with. You wind up with cells that will be turned on to become a brain cell, turned on to become a liver cell, and they have to be able to morph quite a bit. So the fetus is really susceptible to carcinogens, environmental factors. Even while it's in utero, you can, if the mother drinks too much, if she does drugs, if she gets x-rays, the fetus is more at risk even than she is. And so a good example of how the genetic predisposition is affected by everything else, the BRCA1 gene, the BRCA gene we call it, that predisposes you to breast cancer quite highly, with testing women born in different eras. 24% of women born before 1940 who have the BRCA gene got breast cancer. 24%. After 1940, 67% of women who have this get breast cancer. Even though they're slightly younger, they're more likely to get breast cancer than the older women who have that same gene. And it's largely because things have changed so much for us during the time. The things we eat, the things we're exposed to, tanning beds, you know, it's a lot of things that we expose ourselves to that people back then weren't exposed to. So even though 24% is still a big number, it's nothing like 67%. This is, you know, way more than twice, almost 3 times the number. Another thing is that tobacco smoke is still the main cause or the biggest cause of cancer in Western civilizations. Lung cancer, a variety of other cancer. However, tobacco-caused cancers are not the ones that are going up. We have other cancers like colon cancers and brain cancers that are happening more often now than they were 20 years ago. And they have nothing to do with cigarette smoke. So cigarette smoke is still the big player, but other things are causing these other cancers to catch up. So here's our fetus. Epigenetics, whatever the mother's system imposes upon the child, and then whatever comes in from the outside. Again, if she's a smoker, if she's a heavy drinker, if she's doing crack cocaine, if she's, you know, if she's exposed to a virus and has HIV or something, the developing fetus will be a lot more likely to have an epigenetic mutation that will cause that kid to have cancer, maybe in utero or shortly after it's born. Remember that, you know, if the mom has a mutated body cell, if she has breast cancer, that doesn't go to the baby breast, you know, those are body cells. But if she does something that alters her germ cells, then those will be carried forth into the child. The BRCA1 gene, for instance. In the environment, just in general, tobacco is still the most prolific causer of cancer. Lots and lots of carcinogens in there. And it's not clear yet whether the e-cigarettes are going to give the same kind of cancer risk that smoking does. There are some toxins in the smoke that are not there in the e-cigarettes. However, there's a big rise in the use of e-cigarettes because it's kind of cool and because people think it might be safer, but they haven't been around long enough for us to know really if it's any safer than smoking or not. It does avoid giving secondhand smoke to your kids who might be in the same room with you, pretty much, although we don't even know yet for sure whether the vapor is going to carry some of those same properties as the smoke did. Myeloid leukemia, lung cancer, urinary tract cancer, GI cancers, especially from kind of swallowing some of the saliva that contains all of this carcinogenic smoke and stuff, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, cervical and uteral cancer. So a lot of cancers are enhanced by cigarette smoke. Secondhand smoke is really serious for kids. You think, well, you know, it's so diffuse, but kids are more susceptible. So it's like they're smoking if you're smoking in the same room with them. Smoking any kind of tobacco or even chewing it causes a lot of cancer. Cigar and pipe smoking, again, the secondhand smoke is certainly still there for anybody else in the room, but you swallow so much more of the carcinogen that it leads to a lot of mouth and throat and esophageal and stomach cancers. Diet. Our diet these days may account for 30% of cancers. maybe, we like to blame things that the manufacturers put in the food, nitrites and the like, and they play a factor. But it's also cooking of meat proteins, especially grilling, charring, frying, cooking them really thoroughly like that, as opposed to maybe boiling or something like that, produces what are called xenobiotics. And they are like other biotics. Xenophobia is a fear of other types of people. So xenobiotics are other types of biotics that have been changed by the heat process, and now you're taking them in and they become a carcinogen that can change your genetics, or epigenetics in particular. Foods that decrease your cancer risk, we know: fruits and vegetables, high fiber foods, whole grains, vitamins A, B6, C, D, and E, some of your antioxidants. Folate is an antioxidant. Whole grains, lycopene, which comes from tomatoes, legumes, nuts. These have an antioxidant effect that reduces the superoxides, reactive oxygen species, and their ability to change your genome and makes you less likely to have cancer. One study said that women who eat cabbage 3 times a week are 30% less likely to get breast cancer just by eating cabbage 3 times a week. I like cabbage anyway, but man, if I were a woman, I would be eating cabbage 3 times a week. Now, it may be that women who eat cabbage 3 times a week are eaters of good high-fiber vegetables in general, so it may not be as specific as that. But eating these foods really does make a difference. Increased cancer risk: fats, especially saturated and hydrogenated oils. Omega-6. We know omega-3s are good for you. They come from fatty fish. Omega-6s are not. They're almost like a carcinogenic fat from the outgo. High glycemic index carbohydrates. Eating lots of sugar, lots of white bread, and the like. Now, of course, different people have different genetic predispositions, because Asians don't get a lot of cancer and they eat a lot of white rice. So, it depends on how your body processes that food that makes the big difference. It's not that sugar or bread or rice are bad for you, but if you eat them in large amounts, it causes insulin and glycemic changes and glycosylates some of your hemoglobin in a way that turns out to be epigenetically harmful, potentially. Lots of preservatives. Some preservatives have carcinogens in them, and overabundance of anything isn't good for you. Too much alcohol, grilled blackened foods and fried foods, especially meats, and very refined grain products, primarily the high glycemic index thing with them. Obesity is a risk factor for cancer, some kinds of cancer. It almost is like the high glycemic index thing. Changes your insulin properties, changes your glycosylated hemoglobin, esophageal cancer, colon cancer, colorectal cancer, liver cancer, gallbladder, breast cancer, cervical, kidney cancer. Some really bad cancers are higher in obese people, even though those obese people may not eat any differently than the non-obese person as far as how much sugar or whatever. Just the fact that they are obese makes them more likely to get cancer. Abdominal obesity is associated with insulin resistance. It's why people tend to get type 2 diabetes when they are obese. The relationship, and this is true of a lot of dietary things, where you can find a lot of evidence on the internet saying, well, if you eat this, it's great for you. If you eat that, it's bad for you. It's a correlational thing that makes it very obvious to some people looking at it that these are the relationships. And obese people definitely get more cancer than not obese people, but it's hard to find the exact cause because so many obese people don't eat exactly healthy anyway, as one reason that they're heavy to begin with. This is body mass index. Remember from A&P2 we had BMI, which is, you know, your weight divided by your height, and it's just a height-weight relationship. And looking at low BMI compared to high BMI, death risk from cancer is, you know, goes way up. I mean, it's almost a direct line all the way up to morbid obesity. With women, they get away with it for a while longer. Women can carry a little bit more fat than guys because guys tend to carry it all in their trunk. And so even modest obesity in a guy is a really bad thing. If a woman's carrying more of it on her hips and thighs, it's not as related to cancer. But you can see beyond the true cutoff for obesity, which is around 35% or 35 BMI or a 35% body fat, it goes way up as well. Alcohol causes inflammation. It causes inflammation of the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, the stomach. People get more ulcers because of this inflammation. And we've already seen how inflammation and the effect of your own immune system on those cells, perhaps changing the DNA or the epigenome, can predispose you to cancer. So people that drink alcohol all the time, especially in excess, are way more likely to get these kind of cancers, where the cancer actually goes. Also, liver, which becomes inflamed because it has to process the alcohol after you absorb it. So you're more likely to get liver cancer if you're a heavy drinker. Your body can metabolize 1 to 2 drinks a day, especially if you don't drink them in 30 minutes. You know, if you have a drink at 5 and then you have a glass of wine with dinner, there's some evidence that that actually makes you less likely to have heart disease and therefore is not necessarily bad. I would not encourage people to drink to try to save their heart. But, you know, if you have a tendency to have 3 or 4 drinks, that's going to be bad for you. Cigarette smoking and alcohol together are worse. You know, if this makes you 24% and this makes you 24%, you put them together and you're not 48%, you're like 80% or something. I mean, those are bigger numbers than are real, but the synergy between the two is not good as well. Radiation. Well, you know, there's background radiation, and we're not talking about UV rays. We'll talk about that separately, but there's radiation from the environment. There's radiation from the sun. There's radiation from chemicals in the ground, natural and man-made chemicals. There's radiation from what you breathe in, especially if you live in a city that has air pollution. We get a lot of X-rays and radioactive type things from medicine these days. I'll have a chart on the next slide, I think, that shows how much that's increased. And it can cause cell death. That's why you have radiation therapy for breast cancer. You're actually killing cells with it. It can mutate the actual DNA or epigenetics as well. And if you happen to be planning on getting pregnant and you cause this genetic abnormality in the eggs in the female or the sperm in the male, if those are actually altered at the time of they combine, or at some time later, before they have changed so much to become a specific body type cell, those can be passed on to the offspring. Diagnostics now. Everybody that goes in to the emergency room has an X-ray or a CT scan. They're afraid of missing something and having you die because they didn't do a test. So that's not great. I mean, it's good in that we have the ability now to look in and see, that you actually do have a brain tumor. You really do have a kidney tumor. It really needs to be removed instead of just guessing from the outside. On the other hand, it really does expose you to a lot of radiation. A CT scan is really a whole bunch of X-rays. Slice, 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 slice. Computed tomography means a computerized slicing mechanism for your images. And it takes about 50 of them. So a CT scan is 50 times more radiation than a single X-ray. So in the early 1980s, which to a guy like me doesn't seem that long ago, it seems long ago to you probably, but our background radiation was by far the greatest chunk of radiation we were exposed to. Medical only 15%. But now about half of the radiation that the average person gets comes from medical procedures. This hasn't gone up much. This is just kind of straightened out and is now that, But what we've done is we've added so much more medical procedures. My wife has had back surgery. She's had knee surgery. She's had Achilles tendon surgery. And she broke her neck when a truck hit her in an accident on the island we lived on. And she's probably had a dozen CT scans. We're worried. There's nothing we could do. They couldn't repair her neck, her broken vertebrae, until they saw exactly where the breaks were. They had to do the CT scans. But, after a while you start to worry that it really can cause her to be at high risk for cancer later. Occupational and industrial, 0.1%. Some people are exposed to some industrial, radiation, but it's really a tiny amount. Mostly, it's background from the just general environment and medical procedures. Now, ultraviolet radiation from the sun, also from tanning beds and stuff if you do that, mostly is from the sun, and it directly changes DNA in the cells. It can kill the cells. It can cause them to morph into cancer cells. People who are out in the sun a lot get skin cancer. I grew up in Miami, south of Miami, out in the farm country. We were out in the sun all the time. We played outside. We didn't play inside. We weren't using sunscreens in those days. We didn't start doing that until I was probably about 20. That was and then we were putting on like a 4 or 6. And then I moved to the Caribbean and lived there for 10 years. And, now here I am at 7,500 feet in Taos, where the sun is really harsh. I do wear like a 30 to 50 block now. But I've endured a lot of sun in my life, and I'm lucky I haven't had more trouble with it, but I did have a basal cell carcinoma removed from my cheek not long ago, and you'll see what that looks like. So, basal cell carcinomas, squamous cell carcinomas, and melanomas You know, these two guys, we'll talk about them when we get to the skin, you know, the integumentary system. More specifically, they, if you do something about them soon enough, are not usually serious. Now, when you see the operation, it looks pretty serious, but at least it wasn't life-threatening. Melanomas metastasize so quickly that they really are life-threatening. Sunlight. UVA causes you to wrinkle. UVB causes you to get cancer. UVA, wrinkling. UVB, cancer. Now, when I first started using sunscreens when I was 20 or so, they were only UVAs. I mean, so I waited too long to start using, for my best health, for using sunblocks in the first place. And the first one they came out only blocked UVA because that was the one they thought was important. Now, you look at a block and it better cover both UVA and UVB if you're going to make yourself safe. Tumor necrosis factor is released in a way to try to prevent the cancers from growing. But not only are you causing DNA damage, you're producing a lot of free radicals from this UV light. Free radicals bind to things, cause them to work differently, affect your epigenetics, affect your genetics, and cause skin cancer. Inflammation, too. Inflammation. So, basal cell carcinomas, look at that. You can barely even see it. You know, it's just can be a really small dot. I had one that looked kind of like this. It would kind of go away, and it would come back, and I'd put some retin-A or something on it, and it would go away, and it would come back, and it was just a small dot about the size of a BB that didn't go away long enough that I finally went to a dermatologist and had him check it out. Well, this is what they had to cut off, about the size of a quarter. And the stitch they had to put in afterward to keep it from puckering and pulling my eyelid down went all the way around in this big S formation. It turned out well, but for a BB-sized carcinoma, that's kind of a big deal. It was a big enough deal that I'd rather not go through it again. People are worried about electromagnetic waves, worried about living near power lines. So far, there's no evidence that it does anything at all. That living near power lines, sitting in front of your TV, using your cell phone, people are worried about it, and maybe with good reason. But so far, there's no definitive evidence that it does anything bad to you. Mild evidence, no conclusions, we just don't know. I'd probably not buy a house under power lines myself because we don't really know yet. What about cell phones? People spend so much time with their cell phones right in their face, looking at the rays given off by the screen, holding the cell phone next to their head. Is that a problem? And that is going to become a greater and greater and greater behavior. Everybody's doing it now, and everybody's going to do it more as time goes on. Well, there are brain changes while you're on the phone. The radiation is causing activation of brain cells. Is that going to mean they're going to be inflamed if it's chronic? We don't know yet. It may just be they're being activated because you're doing something more. So it's not clear yet, but, you know, I'm kind of an old fart anyway, and I don't use a cell phone as much as my students do. Maybe that'll help make up for the fact I was in the sun too much when I was a kid. Sexually transmitted diseases. HIV, HPV, human papillomavirus, some of these are very, very likely to cause cancer. Almost 100% of women with cervical cancer have HPV. Almost no women who don't have HPV ever get cervical cancer. This one causes inflammation of the cells, it causes DNA changes, and causes cervical cancer. So that's bad. Cervical cancer is really bad. We do have a very effective HPV vaccination. This is one, if I had a daughter, she would already have that vaccination. It's almost sure of preventing you from getting HPV, which is almost sure of preventing you from getting cervical cancer. Oops, forgot that wasn't working. HPV, genital warts are produced. Males and females can both get it. It's obviously ugly, can be mildly painful, usually not unless it's so big that it blocks something or whatever, but very likely to cause cancer. Women are way more likely to get the cancer than men, even though both may have the HPV virus. Physical activity is one of a great preventer of cancer. Now, if you go outside and run for long distances, put on a sunscreen so you don't get skin cancer, because exercise doesn't help prevent skin cancer, but breast and colon cancer, and to a lesser degree, a few of the other cancers too, are prevented by good amounts of physical activity. Now, there are a couple of things that happen. Of course, if you exercise, you're less likely to be obese. If you exercise, your food moves through the colon more quickly, and food that sits for a long time produces a lot of acids and things that cause inflammation and cause colon cancer. So part of it is just that kind of physical thing. But exercise also reduces your need for insulin because it draws the sugars into the muscle cells where they're needed, even without the effect of insulin. It's called the insulin effect of exercise. And so it really improves your overall glycemic response and index, glycosylated hemoglobins, and the like. Decreases inflammatory free radicals and things, and we know inflammation's a bad thing. Increases gut motility to move the food through faster, and reduces stress. And we know that stress releases cytokines that cause inflammation that causes cancer. So stress can have bad effects on most diseases, including cancers, and it's a great stress reliever. So what I've told our medical students they didn't have time to exercise, but those who made time to exercise were healthier and happier, and you can do some pretty good studying while you're running. You can go through memorizations of different structures or chemicals or reactions or whatever while you're out on a run. If you, when you're in school, manage to take care of yourself physically and include physical activity, you're going to be healthier and you're going to reduce your cancer risk as well. Various chemicals are carcinogens. Paints, insulation, cleaners, a lot of household cleaners have mild carcinogens in them, which if you expose yourself forever without wearing gloves is not good for you. Inhaled particles, especially asbestos, but coal and cotton, people wind up with things like black lung and white lung or gray lung or whatever they call the cotton inhalation one. Asbestos turned out to be very carcinogenic. Now if you buy a house and there's any asbestos insulation anywhere, or the floor is asbestos tiles, they have to bring in guys in hazmat suits and take it out so that you aren't exposed. Lung cancer, mainly in the bronchi and tracheal cancers, bladder cancers, Mesothelioma and lung cancer from asbestos. We'll talk about these diseases separately. The mesothelium, the covering around organs, these sheets they're kind of layered, and the mesothelium is that middle layer. And mesothelioma is a tumor or growth or inflammation depending on the stage of this mesothelioma. You see it on TV all the time, lawyers wanting to find people that were exposed to asbestos and now have mesothelioma and sue somebody. Air pollution. There's going to be a lot of cancers in Beijing caused by the monstrous air pollution that they produced with their huge industrialization that sort of went out of control. Real successful in making stuff, but also really successful in making their people sick. Tobacco smoke indoors. Radon gas it comes from the ground. It is something that is natural. Some parts of the world have it more than others. If you get your house radon tested and you have radon gas, you're supposed to do some kind of major work underneath the house to try to block it so it doesn't come up into the house. Breathing in the gases from heavily cooked meats. Arsenic found in groundwater in some places, or the foods that are grown, crops that are grown with that water. Compromised immune system, HIV. People with AIDS die of a variety of things. AIDS itself doesn't kill you. What kills you are the diseases that are opportunistic because your immune system is so bad. And Kaposi sarcoma is a cancer that is always waiting to happen, but your immune system controls it. Almost nobody gets it who isn't immunocompromised. And what about childhood cancers? Well, children don't get cancer much because cancer is mostly a combination of genetics and environment, and they haven't been around long enough to have the environmental factors thrown in. But it is the leading cause of disease death for kids because they usually don't have life-threatening diseases either. So, 2.4 per 100,000, it's not a lot unless you happen to be one of them or your kid happens to be one of them. They've gotten a lot better at dealing with these cancers, especially leukemias that used to just be a death sentence are not necessarily so anymore. It comes from the mesodermal layer. That's where they tend to have the DNA abnormalities. And this is where your connective tissue and bone and muscle comes from. Kidneys, lymphatic system. So these cancers have a tendency to be leukemias and sarcomas, lymphomas sometimes. Carcinogens, which means this layer where there is carcinomas are epithelial layers, like the lining of your skin, the lining of your lungs, lung cancers. Kids don't get lung cancer. They are exposed to secondhand smoke and they may get it later as adults, as even young adults, but it doesn't have time to give them cancer when they're kids still. So most kids' cancers are very in utero exposure or genetically born with them, cancers, rather than environmentally produced ones after they're a kid, because it takes a while for the environmental factors to cause cancers. Embryonic tumors, if you have a genetic predisposition, a retinoblastoma, for instance, it's a problem with the retina actually growing into a tumor, or leukemias, very common. relatively common. Leukemia, the most common in kids. Kids with Down syndrome, and there are a couple of other genetic disorders that cause an increase in cancer risk in kids. Sarcomas, bone tumors, and the retinoblastoma or neuroblastoma is less common, but still these are some that will show up in kids very early in life. Here's the retinoblastoma. This kid has a tumor behind the pupil, and as a result, it's shining through. This kid's blind in that eye. There's nothing, it's blocking off the light from getting back to the retina. Chromosome abnormalities such as Down syndrome predisposing to leukemia. Aneuploidy, remember the wrong number of genes on one locus. Amplifications, deletions, problems with the genome. Wilms tumor, urogenital abnormalities kind of go hand in hand. Down syndrome and leukemia is one that's known the most. Here we have Bloom syndrome. This is one that makes you so sensitive to sunlight that you're likely to get skin cancer pretty young, because anytime you go out in the sunlight, so you have to cover yourself really well and make sure you're not producing all of this inflammation of the skin. Prenatal exposure. Not too long ago, women were getting x-rays to look at the developing baby. They didn't know back then that x-rays cause cancer. So here they were bombing the kid with DNA damage while they were still in utero. Now they use ultrasounds and things, so they don't have to give them any radiation at all. And then childhood exposures to secondhand smoke, x-rays if they're sick, viruses which can cause cancers, Epstein-Barr virus, that's a virus that is, we're going to see it everywhere, and AIDS. If the kid is born with AIDS because mom had AIDS or HIV, then that predisposes the kid to cancer too. These days, more than 70% of childhood cancers are either cured or go into long-term remission. Especially, they've gotten good at the leukemias. Retinoblastoma, usually the eye has to be removed. I guess you could say it's cured, but it's not exactly. But at least they live through it. And kids, the younger they are, the more likely they are to survive. You get over about 15 and you're more like an adult in your responses. But little kids who have tumors removed and stuff, they're growing so fast and so well that they tend to heal over, recover from those surgeries, dramatic surgeries, or even radiation therapy and stuff. A kid who has cancer, though, is always at higher risk for having a recurring cancer later. One of the terrible things for kids is the psychological sequelae, means what's going to happen afterward. And, you know, a kid who spends months in a cancer ward, bald-headed, and having people come in and poke them and stuff, it's hard for them to recover completely psychologically from that. They're always going to be a little bit altered and not maybe have the same carefree childhood attitudes as their playmates might, even if they survive it. Okay, that's cancer epidemiology.